Hello everybody and welcome to the 11th Jerusalem Writers Festival in Mishkenot Shaananim. My name is Liberman. I'm a journalist and today my guest is Pulitzer Prize winner Jennifer Egan. She is the author of 6 novels and short story collection. She won the Pulitzer Prize in 2011 for her innovative novel Visit from the Goon Squad, and last year she has published a sibling novel, I would say, called The Candy House. And when a friend of mine heard that I'll be interviewing she said it's gonna be the peak of my career. High expectations, but I do feel there's a different breeze up here, the peak. So thank you for being here, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you all.
And so, first of all, I want to tap into the struggle of one of the first characters presented in the Candy House. I'm talking about Beats. He's a media mogul, a tech icon, and he is terrified of the possibility that he will no longer be able to create something as big and exciting as the network, the media network that he created. I'm curious to see if you ever had to deal with the same anxieties as a writer, especially after the huge success of the Goon Squad.
Yes, I definitely did, although the anxiety wasn't really about the new book, The Candy House, because I wrote another book before that, and that one, it was subsumed in, at times, really a kind of terror that I just couldn't do anything good again. And the problem is when you feel really frozen and terrified, it's not a great working environment. I sometimes think I'm a terrible boss of myself, because if I had a boss who spoke to me the way I speak to myself, I would definitely throw my materials on the floor and storm out. Exactly. So yeah, it was really hard for a while there. Part of it was that the book that I was working on was actually a very hard one for me to write. And I think it's the last book of mine that's come out here, but it was a historical novel, kind of noirish wartime thriller set outside my lifetime in the war years in New York. And what I learned was that while I never write about myself or people that I know, I actually rely very heavily on environments that I remember. So just details and the kind of feeling of a moment, the physical environment and the mood. And so, of course, writing outside my lifetime, I didn't have any of that. So that fact, coupled with it really felt to me sort of over success of Goon Squad, combined to make me feel like I was definitely headed for a total catastrophe. And it did take 7 years to write that book, but it was nice to get past that point, because I don't think, although I was working on some of the chapters of The Candy House at the same time as this historical novel, I wasn't attempting to make them into a book yet. And I think trying to make a book that actually connects to the other book that felt over-rewarded would have been, absolutely impossible. So I got all of that hysteria out of the way, which was great.
But you didn't feel any blank space where you can't even imagine and you don't feel any creativity?
No, you're thinking, so I feel badly because I think probably a lot of people in this room haven't read the book since it hasn't come out here, but it begins with this guy who, in my world, has invented social media. And that notion of connection came to him in the early 90s in a sort of, in a kind of vision. And so,
a eureka moment.
Yes, and so he's waiting, he thinks there's another vision, and he can feel it kind of prickling on the edges of his mind, but when the moment comes to really look at it, he discovers that it's white. There's nothing, it appears that there's nothing there. I gotta knock some wood. I haven't had that experience, but I think the reason is just that my method of writing is very improvisational. I write fiction by hand. My handwriting is virtually unreadable, so I don't have the problem of being confronted with what I'm writing and discovering its flaws immediately. And I like all of that. I keep the process very blind, and that there are a lot of good things about it, about doing it that way. The biggest one is I think it actually just gets to the best material. That my conscious mind isn't that great a storyteller. And the proof of that is, like, if I'm at a dinner party, I'm not the one who tells the great story. So that's my conscious mind. It's not that great at storytelling. I have to
We had a conversation before, and you told me a few good stories, and it was only a 15-minute conversation, but as you said, you're the worst boss of yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Abusive boss.
So I have to sort of get underneath that, and this process is very good at doing that. But the other thing that's good about it is just that it because it involves, by definition, writing badly, I don't have that problem of the blank page. And in fact, when I'm writing original material, what I require of myself is 5 to 7 handwritten pages, and I don't read them over when I finish. So I don't really know how good or bad it is, and therefore the blank page doesn't really exist for me. I fill it, even if I fill it with really horrible stuff that I don't want to read. When I ultimately type it up, it's so much easier to revise something that exists than to create something out of nothing, I find.
So you write it by hand. I feel like I don't even remember how to write by hand. It's like handwrite. It's a skill that...
It's a disappearing skill. Yeah, and printing doesn't do it. There's the flow of cursive, which young people don't really learn. I mean, my kids don't write cursive. So
right.
and there are, I'm sure, other ways to achieve this effect. But for me, handwriting it's the physicality of it is really a meditative element. There's something about actually holding a pen and moving it across a paper that for me is, and by the way, not getting messages sent to me on the same machine that I'm using to write is also pretty nice. And I love to work outside. I mean, there's some actually real advantages. I love working in the sun and being outside when I work. And in fact, during COVID, I worked outdoors through the whole winter in New York. So that was pretty crazy. With heated blankets. I looked like a nut. Anyway, that is how I think I avoid that sense of emptiness that he experiences.
Okay, I see. Now I want to talk about another fear of yours. I was surprised to hear that you are, and correct me if I exaggerate, but somewhat of a technophobe. Kind of?
Well, I wouldn't say technophobe, because to me phobia is a real thing. Like, I used to have a public speaking phobia, and it was so hard. Okay. It's amazing how often you need to actually address more than 2 people at a time in life. So it was great to get over that ultimately. But I would say that I'm sort of tech averse. I'm not drawn to it. I'm not very good at it. And so it doesn't in and of itself hold much of an allure for me, you know.
And that is surprising because, you know, a main theme in your writing is the how technology affects and changes our human interactions and really controls almost every aspect of our lives. So how do you explain that gap?
Well, I mean, again, you know, I don't really write about people like me. I try to avoid that. I'm not interested in it. So the very fact that I am so turned off by technology, and just on a practical level, I'm turned off, and on a more broad level, I'm terrified. I mean, I really am worried about all the time about what some of this technology is going to mean for us. So in a way, the very fact that I feel those ways means that I need to get into a very different mindset if I'm going to even think about technology in fiction. And the truth is, the very fact that it has changed our lives so much is fascinating. I mean, I'm interested in human life, that's my subject, and I'm especially interested in people who are unlike me. So the fact that I am not interested in tech certainly doesn't, close it off as a world to explore. And, you know, I think about, I was born in 1962, and by the time I went to college, so 18, 19 years later, the only sort of telecommunications development I was aware of was call waiting. So imagine 18 years of stasis. And call waiting was actually a big deal because it meant, when your daughter became a teenager, you didn't have to get a second phone line, as my parents did, because no one could get through on our phone because I was on the phone all the time. And then the answering machine came along, et cetera. We all know the rest. So I feel like I've watched an extraordinary transformation and a rate of transformation that seems only to accelerate. So how would I not end up being fascinated by this narrative that I've witnessed in my life?
And maybe if you consider that writing about technology is also a way for you to deal with this ever-changing world, but as a spectator, not as a participant.
That's true. It definitely. But interestingly, I think another thing happens, which is that I feel a lot of dread about technology, and I actually was feeling a lot of dread in general when I returned to the material that I had begun writing in 2011 and 2012. And I think part of it was the Trump years, the pandemic. I mean, it was a very gloomy time in American life, and really for everyone. And what I learned, though, in the course of writing The Candy House, which I think is a very optimistic book, actually, is that I have so much faith in human beings. And I had forgotten that, or I wasn't feeling it consciously. I'm very obsessed with the climate crisis. I think about it constantly. But what I felt, what comes through to me in The Candy House is just a lot of faith in our collective ability to solve problems when we really decide to solve them. So sometimes what I learned from writing a book is that I don't think what I thought I thought.
When you started writing it,
yeah.
By the end of writing it,
I learn what I really think because so much of it is
like
happening.
Therapy.
Well, it's definitely discovery. That's what I would say, and that's what's fun about it. That's why I do it. That it's all about discovery.
Right, and The Candy House brings back characters from the Goon Squad, and it's also written in a similar fashion. That's why it's a sibling novel. But it also reminded me of an earlier novel of yours, which I loved, and it's called Look at Me. It was published in 2001. Before 9/11 or after?
The week of 9/11.
And that's crazy because there's a character there who's a Muslim terrorist. So that's a coincidence, I guess.
Well, there were a lot of coincidences around that book. And in general, I find that if I'm thinking forward, it's not uncommon that other elements are moving forward at the same pace. I mean, I guess the way I think of it is we're all responding to the same set of cultural facts. I'm responding imaginatively, and other people are responding in other ways. I mean, there's an invention in Look at Me that is, a lot like social media, which didn't exist.
And a lot like reality TV. That's why it reminded me, and I'll explain why it reminded me of the Candy House, because in the Candy House, the technology allows people to upload their memories and search for other people's memories and consciousness. And Look at Me, there's a vision, there's a plan to use the internet, to use raw life experiences of normal people for entertainment. And the connection between these two examples, these two features between the Candy House and Look at Me, is the fact that they kind of dismantle the classical storytelling. Do you think the world is heading in that direction where classical storytelling will no longer be relevant?
I really hope not. But I think that one thing I often think about is that the novel as a genre began in what we would call a very experimental fashion. I mean, the early novels are really daring and often strange. I mean, I'm thinking of Don Quixote or Tristram Shandy. These are books in which the authors pull together all different kinds of discourse. So there are letters, there are legal documents, there are graphic elements. There's a black page in Tristram Shandy. So the way I see it is that the novel was invented because it was flexible and because it could absorb other forms into itself and bend them toward the purpose of storytelling. So when I write a book like The Candy House or A Visit from the Goon Squad, or to some degree Look at Me, that is less conventional narratively, I think I'm being a bit of a traditionalist. I'm just harking back to an earlier moment in the history of the novel.
So when people say the Goon Squad is innovative, and they usually mention the chapter in which you have PowerPoint, it's all written in PowerPoint. What does it mean that it's considered so innovative, and that this is the headline that people will take from that book?
I think I'm getting away with murder, because I think if they knew their literary history better, they might not think I was so innovative. I mean, but I don't want to make light of the fact that it is very challenging to use unconventional storytelling forms. It's not easy, because you can't just graft them onto a story that could be told conventionally. What I find is that the only way I can use any unconventional form, and in The Candy House, there are some, I wrote a long piece for Twitter at 140 characters, so that's probably the most unusual. There's also a chapter narrated in the first person plural as we. There's a chapter in the form of a kind of a sort of nonfiction case study. So there are all different approaches, but what I find is that I can only use any of these effectively if I've somehow nudged my way toward a story that actually couldn't be told any other way. The form has to be essential.
So it's not only a gimmick.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a gimmick, but I'm saying that it has to be justified.
It has to be essential. Yes. I mean, even more than justified. For example, with PowerPoint, it's actually quite hard to write fiction in PowerPoint for a couple of reasons. I learned this the hard way as I tried and failed. I actually sold that book without that PowerPoint chapter, because I knew I wanted to use PowerPoint, but I just couldn't do anything interesting with it for two reasons. One, it's very hard to portray action in PowerPoint. It's a completely atomized form. And the little dissolves between, slides that Microsoft lets you do is just to give you the illusion of flow, because there is actually none. You're looking at one thing and then another thing. That's why it's useful for presenting information. The other thing is it has a cold corporate vibe. It's a business tool, largely. And that was also kind of a bummer in the realm of fiction. And my first thought was, well, it should be a corporate story, because what other story is going to make sense to tell in PowerPoint? But corporate narrative plus corporate form was just eye-crossing. So I just couldn't make it work, and I let it go. But then I started to have some inklings, and this will really speak to exactly how fiction begins for me, about the desert and PowerPoint. And we know already in Visit from the Goon Squad that one of the major characters ends up living in the desert and having a family. That's really all we know. And I started thinking about the desert and thinking about PowerPoint and having this sense of the environment, the physical environment, and feeling like PowerPoint could help me render that. So I begin with a physical environment. That's my way in. And that it sort of flowed from there. So
you also had a very dramatic revelation there that we close the circle and understand that the kid from a few chapters before has died. I mean, I cried in the Microsoft chapter, so it worked.
So this is interesting that you mentioned tears, because many people have told me that they cried during that chapter for various reasons. It's a very sweet family story. And I think the reason that is the chapter that is emotional is that I couldn't write a sweet family story like that conventionally and have it be moving. It would be too sweet. But the cold corporate vibe of PowerPoint ends up offsetting the sweetness so that I'm able to get away with it. The other thing about that chapter, if you think about it, is almost nothing happens. There's a minimal amount of action. And again, PowerPoint being a very static form, was useful in portraying that, whereas written conventionally, I can't even imagine how I would have even tried. There's no way I could have done it. So it feels like luck, and there is a lot of trial and error in this process, because I don't know really what will work until I start doing it. Like, I can think, oh, great, a story about corporate America in PowerPoint. Wow, that's conceptually, it works.
Right.
But if I can't make anything happen, then it's not working.
So the contrast is what worked, I guess.
Somehow, the environment was the key, and then the once I could feel my way in there environmentally, the characters and the action began to flow.
So, you know, putting aside the stylistic way of telling a story, I think there's also, you know, in the attempt at Look at Me to use real stories, authentic stories, and the same as the memories uploaded in the Candy House, it's not only the stylistic style that will change, it's also the fact that maybe there won't be any stories, but just raw material, just information, just in order to achieve authenticity in this age.
Okay, so just for the many people who maybe haven't read the book, just to explain, we were talking about Bix Boughton, an inventor who is having a kind of freak out because he can't figure out what's going to happen next. He does end up inventing something, and it doesn't appear in all the chapters of the book at all, but it ends up being the sort of through line. His invention is called Own Your Unconscious, and it allows people to externalize the whole of their memories, beginning at the moment of birth, onto a beautiful cube that, of course, comes in many colors. And in Bix's mind, the point of this is to have a chance to review one's own life from a present-day perspective. And you can imagine how amazing that would be. Like, I'm often struck by how limited my memories are. So this is a way of actually revisiting your own experience as an adult, as the person you are today, and you can keep renewing the contents of the box, and all kinds of other amazing things become possible. It's a cure for dementia. In many cases, you can reinfuse healthy, complete memory, etc. But there's also another thing, which is users of this machine have the option of sharing all or part of their memories to a collective, the collective consciousness. In Bix's mind,
similar to what we're doing today, sharing
yeah,
all the time.
Except that it's raw consciousness, whatever that means, by the way.
Right.
If you look too closely at this machine, it starts to fall apart very quickly. But anyway, so Bix, the inventor, saw this sharing as really a kind of sideline, not the main thing. But it, of course, becomes the main thing, because people begin to feel that this is the most authentic experience they can have. Social media, everyone decides, is so fake. Everyone is bragging, and they're proselytizing.
Filtering.
Exactly. Now we really got into the real thing, and it becomes so interior life of other people becomes entertainment. So to bring up your point of authenticity, which is really important, I read a book years ago that had a huge impact on me. It's called The Image by Daniel Boorstin, an American historian, I think he's American, who's passed away. This book came out in 1961, and it reads as very outdated now, not only because all of his media examples are from the 50s, so even before my time, but it's written, as I discovered to my horror when I assigned it to my undergraduate class at the University of Pennsylvania, in a very patriarchal and Christian manner that my students did not like, and that actually really kind of grated on me too, even though 10 years earlier I don't think I had noticed it. And a blurb from me is on the cover, which looked pretty crazy when I yanked it off the syllabus. However, the basic points that Boorstin makes are uncannily accurate even to this day. So this book predates mass media, but one of the things he points out is a process whereby mediated experience it is artificial in certain ways, and the consumer perceives that artificiality. That artificiality creates a longing for authenticity, and the world of media then tries to satisfy that craving through ever greater feats of artificiality. But the problem is that it is creating the very craving that it is seeming to solve, and yet we're left pretty hungry. That phenomenon is really interesting to me, in part because it is still so relevant. Right through Be Real, which maybe some of you know of, which is an app that tells you the moment when you have to take a picture of yourself and your surroundings so that it will be real, and you won't be curating and primping.
I got familiar with it like just a few weeks ago.
I think in America it's sort of on its way out. But I was so delighted when my son suddenly took a picture of me on the subway, and I said, "What are you doing? The lighting is terrible. Wait a minute, you're shooting from below. Stop!" And he said, "No, this is Be Real. They tell you when you have, this is real." And I was like, then I was ecstatic. I said, "Oh my God, that's great!" And I filed it away with my ever-growing example of artificial notions that are genuine attempts to create authentic experience. So I'm pretty interested in authenticity as a preoccupation.
The app you mentioned that takes pictures of yourself in the most authentic moment, that brings me to another thing that I've noticed in Look at Me, and then later on in your later works. It's the emphasis that you put on your characters' physical features. Not only in their description, but also in how their physical features influenced their personality and also sometimes the course of their lives. And I wonder if you think physical traits don't always get enough credit for the role they play.
That's interesting. So Look at Me, for I'm sure virtually everyone in the room who has not read it,
you should. You really.
It's about a fashion model who has a huge car accident and her face has to be rebuilt. She looks quote unquote normal. In other words, she doesn't look like that she's damaged, but she no longer looks the same. So she has to re-enter a life in which her job is literally the rental of her image, no longer looking like that person. And so it's very much a book about image and the way in which our self-presentation as objects has the potential to change our inner lives as well. The funny thing is, I'm not sure, I feel like I have to ask you for an example about the Candy House, because I can't think of any person that I describe in detail. So I'm
in the Goon Squad, I think I've noticed it. I after reading Look at Me, then I read the Goon Squad, and I've noticed that you do you do give attention to physical features. Not all the characters in Goon Squad. In Look at Me, it's very you can really see it, because the other Charlotte, also the fact that she's not the pretty one, is also very determinist, I think, in the way she her personality is shaped by that. But I think in the Good Squad, I think that examples from the first chapters, Rhea, for example,
Oh, okay.
yeah. So maybe it's because it was in the beginning of the book and I was just at the end of the Look at Me, so I connected that.
I mean,
But-
Look at Me is explicitly a book about image
Right.
culture. So yes, for sure. There are two people in it whose situations to some degree are a response to their physical appearance. Obviously, the fashion model, and the action of the book is really about what happens to her now that she no longer is herself, at least not in the world she lives in. I would say that I'm not especially interested in physical appearance. It's so funny because I've also been accused of not describing people enough in Goon Squad and the Candy House. So I get, but
I was so excited about it. I thought you give a lot of depth to something that is considered superficial, and I really appreciated it. But people take it to whatever, I guess, their mind is set to.
I'll say this. I mean, I'm interested in the experiences of young women, and very often when I end up, Rhea is a teenager in A Visit from the Goon Squad, and we actually don't meet her again in the Candy House, but she's someone who feels that she's preoccupied with her physical appearance, as so many teenagers are, and I feel very sympathetic to that, and I do think that in the world of young women, it's very clear that there is a pressure, or the sense of a pressure, to appear a certain way, and that is interesting to me. So yeah, I think there are certain situations in which physical appearance really matters, and in those situations, yes, I will try to, render that as much as I can.
And you know what? I want to take you to your former position as the president of PEN America. PEN America is an organization that works to defend and celebrate free expression in the United States and worldwide. Now, when you were the president of PEN America, Trump was the president of the United States. Great timing. And you also filed a lawsuit against him as president. So can you tell us more about that, about the lawsuit and where it stands and why you sued him?
We sued him because he was using his presidential powers to try to muzzle the press. I mean, very explicitly. He was he tried to he went to the head of the post office and said, we have to raise rates against Amazon because Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, is also the owner of the Washington Post, which really was very tough on Trump always, and it drove him insane. And then he would expel reporters from his press corps if he didn't like their coverage, and so we sued him for muzzling the press. He's not supposed to do that. And the lawsuit actually was still alive when he lost the election, at which point it no longer really was valid because he was no longer president.
Oh, so it's no longer valid? Because he's no longer president, so it's automatically canceled?
Yeah, I think it's not, I'm not sure what the legal terminology is for it, but I believe when he no longer was in office, it no longer was a viable suit. And he has plenty of other legal problems to deal with, so I think we are getting him into the courtroom plenty as it is.
But did you feel like as the head of this organization, as the president of this organization, you do have the abilities, the tools to fight against Trump's influence on media?
Well, PEN America, and actually PEN generally, is nonpartisan, so we there were certainly Trump-related issues that we dealt with, absolutely. I mean, one of them was just the vitriol that entered American discourse at that point. And I think there were other aspects of it. Twitter was ever more powerful. Social media discourse has a tendency to be negative, which is a very interesting fact, and that's determined by algorithms. Negative exchanges are more engaging, and that is a term of art, than positive ones. In other words, they bring in more people. It excites people. It creates an emotional reaction, and then more people are on Twitter, which is making the people who are making money from all this a lot of money. So social media discourse tends toward the negative, and there's a lot of interesting writing on that. Trump was, of course, the Twitter maniac. So they're a kind of caustic rudeness and his own rudeness, even in the most rarefied environments, his willingness to insult people in the most gross terms, even in the office of president, was so arresting, and it led to more of the same. And that led to all kinds of things that PEN America did try to respond to. For example, we have a whole social media bullying toolkit. Journalists were threatened and terrified sometimes by what would go on Twitter. Personal threats, people having to go into hiding. So there were all kinds of ways that PEN America, the work that we ended up doing, was related to Trump without attacking him personally, except in that one case where he was, or several cases where he was actually abusing his presidential powers.
But I guess, and I'm saying it from the experience here in Israel, it was probably pretty hard for you to stay or to be considered nonpartisan after facing against Trump and criticizing him.
Not really. I mean, we had also, actually, but I wasn't president at this time, but PEN America released a very detailed white paper criticizing the Obama administration for its extensive surveillance. So, I mean, in the Trump environment that continues in terms of partisan discord, let's say, anything that you say is interpreted, by many people as being partisan. Right. So I think that I'm sure PEN America is not regarded as a conservative organization, for example. But it, like, for example, when I would give talks sometimes in places that were, what we call red states, people would assume that PEN America must be an organization that's liberal and goes after conservatives. But when I would remind them that it was nonpartisan, I could feel how, in some way, everyone was so eager to exit from this strident and honestly also kind of boring structure of interaction. It feels so hard to exit from it. And often it just also feels so dull. It's like none of this language is even original. We're all just saying things that everyone else is saying and that you can read anywhere. And it is a kind of groupthink speaking more than individual. So I felt that our status as a nonpartisan organization, even if I just reminded people of it, resulted in more lively and genuine interactions.
So I'll try to exit from this kind of partisan conversation, because when we examine the world changing around us, free speech is threatened not only by oppressive regimes or populist presidents, but also in a way by the liberal side, aka the cancel culture. Do you ever think that an organization like PEN America can fight against that as well, or should it even?
We often do, absolutely. I mean, in all kinds of ways. Often it happens at universities. There was a case recently, actually, at a Midwestern university where an art history professor with many trigger warnings showed an image that a student who had chosen to stay and watch the slideshow found to be very offensive. And the university ended up firing this woman. A huge hullabaloo ensued, and this professor was not defended by her university. And I'm not president of PEN America anymore, but they rightly spoke out, vehemently and strongly. And I think ultimately the university sort of grudgingly said, oh, well, you can come back. And of course, the professor did not want to at that point. But yes, we absolutely do. Universities are often places where a lot of these conflicts arise. And for example, during the Trump years, when conservative speakers were invited by student groups to speak at universities, they were, in several cases, actually prevented from speaking by protest that was so vehement and sometimes physical that it made it impossible for the person to talk. And we absolutely weighed in on those situations, and in fact ended up developing a whole campus free speech guide. And we went to universities, like scores of them, and colleges, and did trainings to try to help administrators and faculty orchestrate a situation in which protest was allowed, but everyone still had the opportunity to speak. When protest becomes completely nullifying and no one can say anything, that's not right, in our view. So yes, we absolutely do weigh in on that as well.
And you get backlash for it, because it's hard to go against that voice of the cancel culture. It's terrifying, I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting. So even the phrase cancel culture, you don't hear a lot in America anymore. I think that, part of it is...
What do you call it now?
Well, it's interesting. I think that I believe that everyone is hoping for a more nuanced aftermath where first of all, mistakes are possible, and where there's some possibility of just a little more kindness and patience.
Empathy, even for those who were wrong.
Exactly, and tolerance for people who actually do not agree. The idea that you can disagree and not hate each other. I mean, that really should be possible. I think that there is a kind of yearning for that. I mean, for example, I was mentioning earlier that at Cornell, which is where one of my kids goes to college, some students felt they weren't getting enough trigger warnings in what they were reading, and they decided to pass a resolution that demanded that all faculty provide a comprehensive list of trigger warnings about every reading. And they passed the resolution. But the president of Cornell gave it a hard veto. I mean, she basically said that we're not doing this. And she called it a hard no, meaning we're not revisiting this either. And there was very little, I mean, I'm not sure what resulted from that, but there weren't riots. I mean, people accepted it. So I do think that things are mellowing a little on that front.
I guess the problem is nuance, because, I mean, if you do ban Trump from Twitter, which I think is a justified act, I mean, they should have banned him from Twitter.
I think he's back on, isn't he?
Now he's back on because of Elon Musk. But I think it was the right thing to do. However, that allows other people to say that they can cancel or delete or ban other people from speaking, because it's not only their opinions, but they're spreading lies, for example. This is something that, I mean, freedom of speech is not the freedom to lie and, just spread fake news. So
in America it is.
In Israel, of course it is. It's like, let's compete. Or it's so it's hard to draw the line when you wanna protect freedom of speech. But if we have mentioned cancel culture, and I'm curious to see what's the next name for it. I guess it will be a more positive term. But do you ever think that you might be canceled one day for something that you wrote maybe 20 years ago?
I guess that's possible. I mean, I anything is possible. Yeah, I suppose I could be. I would hope that that at least people would look at the whole picture. But yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm revealing in this moment is I don't spend a minute worrying about it. I'll tell you that.
Okay, so we talked about before, there's a chapter in the Goon Squad where there's an attempted rape, and I felt really bad because I sympathized with the journalist who attempts to rape the movie star. And maybe I sympathize with him because I'm a journalist myself, but there was something so... I don't think it's just because of our profession. I think there was just something in the way you described him. He wasn't this evil creature. And I was thinking to myself whether this might have a backlash today if it came out today.
I don't know. It's an interesting question. I mean, I think the reason, I mean, first of all, I should say, I don't write about anyone that I cannot sympathize with. I would actually go so far as to say that sympathizing with the character is literally my job. That's it. So I don't think you'll find any situation in one of my books in which we are inside a point of view that is not... that does not feel close to us and really available. And what I mean when I say that I empathize with the characters, what that means to me is that even if their choices and their actions are as far from anything I would do as they could be, those choices and actions should feel, for the reader who's inside that person's mind, not just plausible, but actually necessary. Their choices should feel necessary if I'm writing about them. So I'm glad to hear that you sympathize with him because we're inside his head. And so we should understand, even if we're horrified, and I like horror. Horror's good. It's also a comic scene, I should add, which I don't think excuses me. In the mind of someone who doesn't think this is allowed, having it be comic is not going to save me. But it is a pretty comic scene in which this guy utterly fails at his attempt, and in fact, she ends up stabbing him. So he loses. But here's the thing I want to say. It's interesting. So I play that scene somewhat for laughs in an environment of horror, because it is shocking what he's doing, and I like that. But what was also clear to me was that if I was going to include that chapter in a book, we would also need to have a sense of what happened to her later. Because of course it would have been extremely traumatic what happened. And it's one thing in a short story to, make my move and then walk away. But if that's part of a larger narrative, I will have to contend with the fallout of that. And I do, because we meet Kitty again, the star, as an older woman who is a wreck.
We meet her before, actually. I mean, we meet her story before we learn about the rape. I mean, we have a...
No, we read the rape.
The sequel.
Do we read... Oh, God.
Yeah. We read...
yes.
Johnson is...
Yes, that's right. So we meet, because there's a lot of backward motion in both of these books. We meet her as a struggling alcoholic, as a sort of midlife actress, and we know that something happened, and that after that thing happened, she went off the rails. So when we read the scene, we already know that it's not a book that is only playing this scene for laughs, because it's part of a larger story in which Kitty's trauma is addressed to some extent. And there's a parallel actually in the Candy House. There's a genre-esque spy chapter, which is the one that I wrote for Twitter, in which a character named Lulu, who's a minor character in Goon Squad, is now in her 30s, and she's working as a citizen agent, meaning she's working as an agent for the US government. She has technology implanted in her body. This is happening in the 2030s. And she's narrating her mission in the form of thought bulletins that she is able to transmit because there's a device implanted in her brain. And because it's a spy story, one of the things I love about genre is that genre really focuses the reader on certain things that are expectations of that genre. So the obvious example would be like a murder mystery. In a murder mystery, it's not about grief. I mean, death is a terrible thing, as we all know, and when someone's murdered, that's an absolute catastrophe. But that if a murder mystery was making that the focus, I think most of us mystery lovers would feel like, come on, I mean, we're here to find out who did it. Let's get going. So that's one of those things about genre that I'm very drawn to, is that it helps me focus the reader. So in this spy story, Lulu, it's an adventure. I mean, wild things happen, but also terrible things happen to her. She too is raped. She is shot. It's a nightmare if you focus on that, which the reader does hopefully to some extent, but not exclusively, and it's the spy part that I think saves me from that. But just as with the chapter you're talking about in Goon Squad, I knew that if I was going to include Lulu the spy in a book, I would have to reckon with the aftermath of all of that. I would have to successfully show the reader what impact all of this had on Lulu and how she solves it. And I didn't know if I could do that. That question hung over me for a very long time.
So basically you're saying that if you write a traumatic experience for a character, it has to have a reason, not only just for the fun of, I wouldn't say fun, but not just for the entertainment of the horror.
I mean, I'm loath to make rules. I guess I can only answer you with the anecdotes I'm giving you. Aesthetically, it didn't, which is the God I'm serving. It didn't feel right to me. It felt easy and actually potentially negligent, to the point that could be offensive, maybe, although I wasn't thinking of it that way, to play these experiences for a kind of genre thrill, include that chapter in a book, and not address the aftermath for this person.
Okay, and how do you think this atmosphere of triggers and criticism affects creativity of writers these days?
I mean, I worry that there's a lot of self-censorship that goes on, which is never a good thing for creativity, I think. I mean, at least in the privacy of our own creative practices, I think it's good that we be very free. And I know when I talk to writing students, I don't teach writing myself, but there's a lot of fear about straying even in one iota from one's own personal experience. And my reaction to that is, well, I would have to switch to just journalism if I'm not allowed to write about anyone except for me, I've lost any interest in writing fiction. And I mean,
but even journalists have to deal with the same critique, that if they touch on things that are too sensitive.
Yeah, I don't know that as well. I mean, you're much more of a journalist than I am. So I guess
I would say that.
I mean, I think what I would say is just that I think policing of the imagination on any level is not a good thing, and I worry that students don't feel like they have the right to write things. And that is not a good, that stymieing climate is not good. And frankly, we're in a moment when fiction as a genre of entertainment is really under siege. I mean, we live in a world just permeated by images, and we are largely controlled, and I include myself in this, by entities who want very much to keep our attention on their stuff and keep us scrolling. So it's not a great moment for fiction writers of all stripes to be terrified to stray outside their own experience. It's not going to lead to the best work, and that just worries me, because it just worries me for the health and the vitality of the genre.
And I did want to ask you if you're worried about where the medium that you excel in, books, novels, will one day just vanish.
I don't worry too acutely about that. It just feels like it's in the category of things I can't control. I guess what I always come back to, in a way, I worry about that less than I worry about something like climate change, because I feel like there is something I can do about fiction. I can try to do a good job, and I'm trying to do that.
It's so funny, because I mean, there's a need for such a collective action to actually fight climate change that I know it's bad, but I personally give it up, because I know that the collective action will never be. So I mean, I do recycle and stuff like that. But what do you mean that you can control it?
Well,
it's really hard to control.
Yeah, but I can't. I guess what I'm saying is I worry about climate change more because I feel so inexpert in addressing it. I can't invent an electric vehicle. I don't understand the kinds of technology that really are going to help us. But when it comes to fiction, I come back to the feeling that the thing I can do is try to do a good job. And try to, express my views, support younger writers. I mean, I'm in that world, so it's not out of my control. It's something that I can live by day to day and try to do my best for. So
okay.
I don't worry about it.
You mean the same thing. You mean that you're not worried. You're more worried about climate change because that you can't control.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think so. I mean, I'm a person who worries a lot. So I do worry about things for sure. But what I come back to when I worry about fiction is just, so write a good book. Stop worrying. Like, put my time into something useful. And there's actually something I could do. Whereas, as you say, recycling, etc. I mean, I do all of that too. And I actually feel optimistic about human ingenuity, as I said. But it does feel overwhelming in a way that the fiction stuff doesn't.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about your technique, because in the Good Squad, as well as the Candy House, you have multiple protagonists. You switch between different points of views. Is there a technique that helps you differentiate the characters and their style of dialogue? Because to me, it looks like it's very easy to accidentally write them all the same, and you don't.
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think that the way I write helps me in that way, because I don't start with characters. So as I said, I start with a physical environment, and the first question, I'm not asking this, I'm just hurtling forward. And I would say that I think my method is very improvisational, in the sense that if you think about theater, improv, or music, neither of which I've ever done, by the way, but I've been an audience member, it's a group of people sort of searching collectively for a line of action that feels alive, and then just kind of pushing into that. And that's kind of what I'm doing on my own when I write fiction. So the first question when I'm in a physical environment is, who is perceiving that environment? because a description is as much a description of the person describing as it is a rendering of the external world. Whose consciousness are we in? And that's really my first inkling of character. And then the question is sort of who else is there? And this is happening spontaneously. And so in a way, what people say is often the first thing I know about them as I write in this way. And I follow those little details that come up spontaneously in a first draft, and I kind of push forward with the ones that feel the most interesting. So I'm following, the differentiation seems to happen very naturally, because I am, just as the reader is, hopefully, following one detail into the next and then into the life that seems to contain them. And so the individuality of the person is, if I don't feel that right away, that's not even someone I'm going to stick with. I would probably just end up cutting that.
But it's so rich. So I do wonder, where do you take it all from? Because you said you don't want to write about yourself. You're not interested in yourself. But is it based on something that you experienced, or it's all just imagination?
Well, what is imagination?
Right, exactly.
It
is based on life experiences, I guess.
I think a lot about dreaming. Well, it's interesting. I don't want to hear anyone's dreams. And there's actually a couple in the Candy House, and in their marriage vows, they agreed not to ever make each other listen to their dreams.
Good idea.
So, but the phenomenon of dreaming is one that I'm very fascinated by, because in a way, if you think about it, when we dream, we are creating works of art. We're creating narrative works of art that are symbolic and often full of dramatic event and sometimes extraordinary landscapes. And we're doing this without any conscious participation, just using the stuff of our daily lives. It's kind of miraculous. And so to me,
Sounds like you have great dreams, because my dreams don't sound like that. They're not that coherent.
I don't dream all that often, but I think everyone knows the feeling of being haunted by a dream. They have power. There's symbolic text with power. So that to me it's that part of me that I'm trying to access when I write fiction. And as I said, the reason is that I do think that we do engage in a kind of groupthink. It's funny, America is flipping out about ChatGPT right now. Oh my God. I'm so bored by it, and I've never even used it. But there's this terror of how effective ChatGPT seems to be. And to me, it's in a way, it's not surprising. If it has access to all of the text that exists online, yes, it is the embodiment of groupthink. That's what it's creating, or group speak. But actually, I think I also engage in group speak. Like, I read some of my first drafts, and it's like they're full of cliches. It's all this language that absolutely doesn't pass muster. So the goal is to get underneath all of that, just to get deeper. And that's where all of this comes from. So, I don't have to have met someone to imagine them. I guess, like ChatGPT, I've met enough people in my life that I can sort of synthesize this into something that isn't any one of those people and yet feels original, and hopefully, in a really visceral way that I'm praying ChatGPT can't emulate.
And when it comes to storylines, not only the characters, but storylines, I imagine that you probably sit with a graph. Do you have a graph?
No. No, I don't. I really don't. The plot is the last thing to evolve, because again, I'm starting with environment, moving into people, and then what they do becomes the plot. And I will often sense plot developments in an environmental way. And what I mean by that is, for example, in Manhattan Beach, a wartime story. It involved shipbuilding and deep sea diving, and I kept having this instinct toward the sea. I kept feeling like there was suddenly a kind of maritime longing. I found myself walking toward boats when I would see them, even though I've never had any interest in boats, and I suddenly was really dying to read maritime fiction. That's its own genre. Indeed, there was a whole maritime element of this book that I was, I think, in denial about because I knew how much research it would require. So I sensed the environment before I knew exactly what events would lead the story into that environment.
But you do a lot of research, as you mentioned.
Absolutely.
So that's some of the inspiration, I guess, for building those worlds.
Research is really inspiring. It's very much more than just learning facts about people's lives. For me, learning those facts and learning about the texture and the feeling of a moment. And I use fiction a lot, actually, in my research, because fiction contains so much information compressed about the period in which it was written. All the things that went without saying are there.
When you do the research, it's not just historic books. It's not just books of about history. It's also just novels from.
Oh yeah, I mean
time.
Research is way more than. I mean, I actually helped to initiate an oral history project in which I and two other entities interviewed like 30 people who had worked at the Brooklyn Navy Yard during World War II. So oral histories, conversations with living people is always a fantastic element of research. It really enlivens all of the other stuff. Collections of letters, diaries, yes, books of history, but I would say those were the least revealing in terms of inner life. So yeah, I avail myself of
Wikipedia. No.
I mean, not that often. I mean, I guess that would be the definition of a starting point. I mean, yeah, maybe to look at the bibliography and see if there were other references that would be useful.
Now we talked about the technological aspects of in the candy house, but it's the setting of something bigger and I guess timeless in the human experience, memories. And maybe also nostalgia. What do you think it means when a culture is in a constant throwback mode, is also always drawn to the past? Because I feel that that's where we're at right now.
Well, I agree, but I'm not sure it's specific. I don't know if that inclination toward the past, that tendency to nostalgize, I don't know if that is unique to us. I think that the way in which we do it is certainly changing all the time and very technologically driven. Some of that is also being driven by commerce. I mean, when it drives me insane when my phone offers up memory montages. I mean, those are yet again efforts to engage me because your phone wants you to be on your phone. That's how all of the entities that profit from that activity profit. So they have to keep you active. And nostalgia is, to use a word in a different context, it's very triggering, it's very engaging, it's hard to resist. I mean, a lot of advertising has always relied on nostalgia. I mean, Trump sold America a nostalgic vision of American life, a period of great prosperity in the post-war era. So nostalgia is a really powerful force and a powerful tool. But I would argue that it's powerful because it is such a deep human inclination to think of the past with a kind of longing, because the passage of time, whether or not it brings tragedy, and in the end it always does, and before our era of of antibiotics, there was more tragedy. It's always a feeling of loss, those little montages that show me my kids when they were, 4 and 6 years old, I feel a kind of anguish when I see them, even though they're alive and well. So that the use of that sense of loss as a tool to manipulate us it's effective because nostalgia is powerful.
Maybe today, more than before, there are more ways to manipulate us in that sense.
Absolutely, yes.
Times ago. I want to quote from The Candy House. Knowing everything is too much like knowing nothing. Without a story, it's all just information. And I love that quote. I think it Well, it actually brings me back to Adam and Eve. But, knowing, just the knowing. And today we just want to know and know and know. There is no more, we're eliminating mystery. And that brings me back to storytelling and how storytelling will survive when we're trying all the time to know everything.
Well, yeah, I think what I was thinking of in that quote, and it came up pretty spontaneously, as so much does for me, but I was interested in the fact that we know a lot, we're drowning in data, and yet that data falls short in so many situations. In other words, it's, no one thought Trump would get elected. He didn't even think so. No one seemed to put together the facts so that we could stop 9/11 from happening. The pandemic seemed to come out of nowhere. So all of this information really has its limits. And I was interested in that. And what I ended up feeling, and this was, I guess, another thing that writing The Candy House taught me, was that interpretation of the data, which is the storytelling component, interpretation is turning data into a narrative, literally.
Right.
Deciding what's important and what it can tell us. That is storytelling. So I found myself feeling that actually storytelling is an essential part of using data effectively, and these two practices that I had thought of as opposites, data collection and storytelling, in fact, are two sides of the same coin.
Okay, I love that. Any questions from the audience? Did you want to say anything?
I was just going to read a few minutes. If anyone would like that. I'll give you a little.
So, I wanted to read it. And then if we have time, we'll have a few questions from the audience. Do we have time?
20 minutes.
So I'm going to just read like 5 minutes from one chapter of The Candy House, which every chapter is written in a different way and has different protagonists. So this is not representative, but it is the one in which I use the first person plural. Okay. It's called The Mystery of Our Mother. Long ago, she told us, when we were just a hope in her heart, or not even that, because she never wanted children, or thought she didn't, a higher power touched our mother's head and said, "Stop what you're doing. 2 little girls are waiting to be born, and you need to have them right away because the world is desperate for their brightness." So she stopped studying anthropology, which she really did love, and maybe would study again someday when you're all grown up and don't need me anymore. We'll always need you. I'll always need you too, that's for sure. I'll try not to drive you crazy with my mommy needs. Till the end. Well, I stopped going to anthropology school, and I married your daddy, and we brought you into the world. And here you are. It all worked out perfectly. Where is Daddy? You'll see him next week. He's taking you to ballet. Last time he never came. I'll be here, just in case. He can't make a bun. Sorry. Oh, God. This is what happens when you don't have a physical copy. Oh, no. I'm so sorry. I couldn't fit my book into my luggage. Okay, here we go. Sorry, all right. He can't make a bun. That's not important, honey. Before ballet? Don't whine, sweetie. He threw Tam Tam out the window of the car. He said she was moth-eaten. That was unfortunate. How could you marry him? Love is a mystery. Does Daddy love you? He loves you. That's what matters. He said we were young spendthrifts. Did he now? He said, can we not talk about what he said? We're just telling you. I don't need to be told. I know your father very well. How did she endure these conversations? Of course our father didn't love her any more than she loved him. He was 15 years older than our mother, twice divorced when they met, with 4 kids, 2 by each ex-wife. How's that for a rotten prospective husband? But he was charming, a famous record producer, and above all, we later surmised, he wouldn't take no for an answer. Why he wanted our mother to say yes is another mystery. They had nothing in common beyond a taste for beauty, his, and beauty, hers. But she never lived by her beauty. She was the kind of mom who rarely wore makeup, who let her hair grow wild, and didn't bother to shower on Sunday, her day off from the travel agency where she went to work after our father stranded her without any money to raise us. On the occasions when our father showed up to take us to ballet, we walked grimly down the cracked outdoor steps from our second-story apartment to one of his many cars. "Hello, girls. One of you want to ride in front?" We shook our heads. It wasn't safe. Everyone knew that except him. "How about something to eat? We've got time before your class." "We don't eat before ballet." "I can't do anything right with you two, can I?" We shook our heads, and he laughed and began to drive. But when he pulled up in front of the strip mall where the ballet studio was, he turned around and peered at us in the back seat. "I'm your father. You understand that, don't you?" We nodded in stony unison. "That's not nothing. That means something." He searched our cold eyes. "You don't like me. Why?" It was not a rhetorical question. He was serious, awaiting a reply. We looked at our father closely for perhaps the first time. His weathered surfer's tan and longish blonde hair, his crooked front teeth. He watched us watch him, and then he laughed. "How would you know?" he said. "You're just two little kids." I'll stop there.
Maybe some people who read the Goon Squad think they know who the father is. Do you?
Great, we have a lot of questions here.
Okay. So, yes.
Hi. Any film or TV offers on your books? Because at least Manhattan Beach lends itself so clearly to cinema.
Yes, they're all usually under optioned. It seems to lead exactly nowhere, except my first book actually became a movie. I didn't realize how unlikely that was because it was the first time. But Manhattan Beach is
Invisible Circus.
Yeah, Invisible Circus. Manhattan Beach is moving forward slowly as a possible feature film. It's the same group who made the film Brooklyn. By Colm Toybean's, adapted from Colm Toybean's novel, and they did a great job, so cross your fingers. And Goon Squad and Candy House were just sold. Goon Squad has been perpetually optioned, and they have now been sold as a pair to Olivia Wilde as the producer and a company. I really don't watch much TV, but the idea is for a series involving the two of them. So again, cross your fingers. It would be fun.
Yeah.
I read the Goon Squad and I said, this is what I'm going to produce. And then I heard about Olivia Wilde. There you go.
It was fascinating to hear about your wild process of getting it out associatively and so on. At what point do you start taming the original output into something with shape, with form, with thinking, with...
I'm so glad you asked that, because I have a tendency to neglect that part of the process, which is by far the longest part. So I write a first draft by hand, and I just go forward. In the case of a book like The Candy House or Goon Squad, I wrote those in parts. So getting to the end would mean 35 pages of handwritten material. But in a way, the process is the same as it was for Manhattan Beach, which was 28 legal pads full of material. I mean, a horrifying amount. So what I do next is I type it up. I don't make any changes as I type. That's a hard and fast rule. I'm so tempted, but I don't know what I'm doing yet. So there's no point in wasting a moment fiddling with a sentence, even though it's very tempting. I even include mistakes. I just leave it is the document as written. Type it up. For Manhattan Beach, that was literally 2.5 months of typing. Then comes the worst part, which is reading it. Because now I'm subjecting this very raw, catch as catch can, some great moments, but a lot of crap, to the rigors of being a manuscript typed up. So that's agony. But I read it and I take notes as I read, and I try to really read it all in one stretch. So I'll even like go away for a day or two, or really sort of isolate myself with the manuscript. And there's a kind of grieving in that process of just recognizing how far it is from being something viable, but hopefully there's also a growing awareness of what it seems like it could be. And what I'm doing is really identifying the most interesting and surprising moments and trying to sense the larger work that contains them. Then I make an outline. That's the first outline I make. And the outline is both cataloging what's there and listing what needs to change. And then I start revising. And I tend to revise by hand on hard copies because so much new writing happens. And then I type up what I've done and spew out a new draft and keep going. And I work on it then in smaller parts, sort of working toward several big iterations. And I should mention, too, that I have a writing group. I actually dedicated the Candy House to my writing group. They are essential. It's only 6 of us. Some of us have been working together since the 90s. I bring in material sometimes at a really early phase just to feel whether the voice is working. But then I also will read a whole chapter and just want to know where is it slow, which would be much further along. And then I have a lot of readers that I give the whole thing to. So I really use feedback because even though after that initial phase of outpouring, I do know what I'm trying to do, but I can't tell if I'm doing it. So I really feel like it's not that I love finding out that anything is wrong, and I can't count the number of times I've been listening to my writing group, give me feedback, which was, mixed, let's say, and I'm thinking, my mental thoughts are, okay, it's been a great run, I am now finished with you. You just don't get what I'm doing, and I'm just not going to take this crap any longer. But in another part of my brain, I can already feel solutions forming. So I seem to thrive on the discomfort of finding out how people feel about what I've done. So that's a longer version of the process. And the outpouring part is fast. I can write, easily 5 to 7 pages in an hour and a half. And then the rest of my day, I will sometimes work on 2 projects at once, just to get that material out there, since it doesn't take that long, but the revision part is endless.
This is kind of a follow-up question, specifically with Goon Squad and Candy House, where each chapter could be a standalone short story. Did you how did you decide to structure those books? Like, at what point did you know the order that they were going to go in? Because they go back and forth in time, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, with books like this, which I think of as ensemble stories, the structure is the last thing to come into place. With Goon Squad, I actually worked on it with a misconception, which is another example of how the ideas that I have consciously are not actually that good. The idea here was, it's in 2 parts. The first part is, the idea is a solidly backward timeline. So part 1, part 2, part 1 is after 9/11, and part 2 is before 9/11. Doesn't that sound great? So I worked on all the chapters. I didn't read them through together because I was it was important to me that they not sort of affect each other. Like you talked about people starting to sound the same. Sometimes I didn't want the chapters to start to sound the same. I really wanted them to keep their unique identity. So
I didn't say they sound the same.
No, you were saying that it would be easy for that to happen, and that the wish not to have the different moods of the chapters start to leak into each other. That was really important to me. So I went to actually rented a room in a hotel in Manhattan. My kids were still younger and yelling and screaming. And I read through all the chapters of Goon Squad in the backward order, and I was sort of hoping for a, explosion of power, and it was exactly the opposite. It lost power as I read, and I thought, oh my God, what have I done? Where have I gone wrong? I thought maybe it's just not a good book. That seemed possible. But I also felt like the backwards order was actually undercutting a lot of surprises and pleasures for the reader. And I realized that basically my structure, I had to let go of chronology, which was a little scary because we tend to rely on it in fiction. But what I found was that I gained so much by letting go of it. So with the Candy House, so the organizing principle really of both books is what is the most satisfying for the reader? What will involve the most surprise and satisfaction of curiosity? And then there are certain other criteria. I don't want the reader to be lost. I want there to be some continuity, even though we feel discontinuity. So there are underpinnings that I'm aware of, but the effect that I want is surprise and recognition. And so calibrating it so that I can get that as much as possible is really how I do it.
You had a question.
You can shout it out and I'll repeat it.
I was thinking about likability and unlikability. You were talking about a character who rapes, and yet we sympathize him. And a lot of people I know won't read books with characters they don't like, but while others enjoy being like pushed the boundaries of empathy. And yet I found many of your books, at the beginning I really didn't like them. I didn't like Sasha. Who is this awful woman? Why is she treating this young man so badly? And yet by the time we reached the end, I really liked her, and I was really glad she had a happy ending. And the same thing with Akip. Danny is a really awful person, and yet somehow he's a lovable asshole at the same time. And I wanted to know, what is it that makes you want to write these characters that way?
Well, it's the issue of likability is kind of fascinating. I think that when people say they don't like the characters, what I think they mean, I shouldn't speak for them. I guess I'll just speak for myself. What I am not looking for a friend to have lunch with when I read a novel. I don't care whether someone is a person that I wanted to invite to a party. What I'm looking for is a feeling of interest and curiosity. And I think that when people talk about characters being unlikable, what they mean is that they feel alienated from the characters. And to me, that alienation happens when I'm reading, not necessarily because I think, gee, this person isn't doing exactly what I would do, but because I feel disconnected from them. I don't feel the essentialness of their choices. And therefore, when their choices are choices I dislike, I feel like, well, forget it. I don't want to stay with you and read about you. You've lost me. But if I understand, if I feel deeply the necessity of their choices, then the farther those choices are from my own choices, the more interesting it becomes. So I do think that the likability may not be the right word for that feeling of being turned off by characters in fiction. I guess the only way to definitively answer it is to say that I do feel that my wish is always to make the inner life of the person I'm writing about feel deeply available to the reader and even kind of and make their choices feel necessary. But I'm neither interested in reading nor writing about people who kind of live the way I do, because what I love about writing fiction is the actual sensation of being lifted out of my life. For me, that's the thrill of it. And that's why I like to read. I love the feeling of just losing my own bearings and becoming someone else.
Okay, well,
happy to keep the conversation going. Thank you so much, Jake.
Talk to someone who can understand what the poet meant. It's nice to understand that. So I want to invite you to Jennifer's book signing now. Next to our book stand, it's further down the hall this way. And again, thank you so much.